On the night of June 17th, 1972, Washington, D.C. was quiet. But inside the Watergate office complex, 5 men moved in the shadows. Gloves, lockpicking tools, recording devices hidden in their bags. It seemed like just another burglary, but this was the night that would open the door to the most dangerous political scandal in American history. Within hours, the men were caught. What looked like a small crime would soon lead directly to the Oval Office. Among the 5 was James McCord, a former CIA officer and head of security for President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign. The Committee to Re-elect the President, CRP. With him were 4 Cuban operatives connected to past covert missions. In their possession, sophisticated cameras, wiretapping devices, and an address book that pointed straight to Howard Hunt, an advisor inside the White House. The evidence was undeniable. The burglars weren't just thieves, they were connected to power. In the days that followed, questions multiplied. Who had sent them? And more importantly, who had paid them? Investigators at the Department of Justice, the FBI, and soon, the press discovered that money from Nixon's re-election committee had been funneled to the burglars. The phrase that defined the scandal was born: follow the money. At the Washington Post, 2 young reporters refused to let the story die. Bob Woodard and Carl Bernstein, with the help of a mysterious source, later revealed to be FBI Associate Director Mark Felt, codenamed Deep Throat. The 2 journalists uncovered a campaign of political espionage, found by illegal contributions, and directed by White House officials. Their reports pulled the threads together. This was no accident. It was a plan. But in November 1972, Richard Nixon won re-election in one of the largest landslides in American history. 49 states, 61% of the popular vote. To the public, the break-in seemed minor compared to the war in Vietnam. But behind closed doors, a storm was gathering. In January 1973, the trial of the 7 burglars began under Judge John Sirica. 4 pleaded guilty, 2 were convicted. But then James McCord wrote a letter to the judge. He claimed there had been pressure on the defendants to remain silent, that perjury had been committed, and that high officials were involved. That letter cracked the cover-up wide open. The scandal was no longer a petty burglary. It was a conspiracy. By February 1973, the U.S. Senate created a special committee to investigate, the Ervin Committee, led by Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina. For the first time in American history, the hearings were broadcast live on national television. Night after night, Americans sat in their living rooms watching the drama unfold. More than 85% of households saw at least part of the proceedings. It was no longer whispers in Washington. It was national spectacle. At the same time, Attorney General Elliot Richardson appointed Archibald Cox as special prosecutor. His mission? To investigate Watergate. Independently of the White House, Cox soon made a discovery that shocked the nation. Richard Nixon had installed a secret voice-activated taping system inside the Oval Office and other rooms. Thousands of hours of conversations had been recorded without anyone's knowledge. These tapes could prove everything. When investigators demanded the tapes, the White House resisted. Nixon claimed executive privilege, saying he had the right to withhold them. But then came another revelation. One recording from June 20th, 1972. Just days after the break-in, contained an 18.5-minute gap. The audio was erased, replaced by a strange buzzing sound. What was said in those missing minutes? Who erased them? And why? No one could prove it, but for the public the gap was enough to spark suspicion. To understand Watergate, we must go back even further. In 1971, the Pentagon Papers were leaked to the press, exposing government secrets about the Vietnam War. Nixon furious created a covert unit inside the White House called the Plumbers. Their mission? To stop leaks, no matter the cost. Among the members, G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt, the same men who would later mastermind the Watergate burglary. The lines between national security, political survival, and criminal activity blurred. And from those blurred lines came Watergate. 5 men caught in the night. A roll of tape on a door latch. A burglary that should have been forgotten, but behind it a machine of money, secrecy, and power. The break-in at the Democratic headquarters was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. A door had been opened, and it would never be closed again. From the break-in at the Democratic Party headquarters to the first threads that linked the burglars back to the White House. But what we're about to tell you now is far more dangerous. The moment when a small burglary became a political earthquake. A moment that revealed to the world how absolute power can corrupt even the highest office in the land. This is the story of revealing the truth. The hunt for the truth begins only a few days after the Watergate break-in. Most of the American press treated the incident as a minor case of campaign espionage. A story that might disappear in the back pages of a newspaper. But 2 young reporters at the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, refused to let it go. Guided by an anonymous source later known as Deep Throat, who was eventually revealed to be FBI Associate Director Mark Felt, they began connecting the dots. A check deposited here, a strange phone call there, a trail of money leading directly to the committee to re-elect the president. Piece by piece, the puzzle started to form. And with every revelation, suspicion grew that this was not an isolated burglary, but part of a larger network of corruption reaching into the Oval Office. Congress launches an investigation by February 1973. The scandal could no longer be ignored. The U.S. Senate created a special committee, led by Senator Sam Ervin, to investigate. The hearings were broadcast live on television. For the first time in American history, millions of citizens could sit in their living rooms and watch their government be questioned. Day after day. It was riveting television. Viewers could see the nervous witnesses, hear their hesitant voices, and witness in real time as small cracks opened in the walls of secrecy around President Nixon. What began as politics quickly turned into a public trial of trust. Then came the revelation that changed everything. A former White House aide testified that President Nixon had secretly installed a voice-activated taping system in the Oval Office. Every conversation, every meeting, every phone call recorded on reel-to-reel tapes. These tapes were the golden key. If released, they could prove Nixon's innocence, or they could expose his guilt beyond any doubt. The scandal was no longer based on suspicions or testimony. It now revolved around physical evidence. The president's own voice. The special prosecutor in the Saturday Night Massacre in May 1973. Attorney General Elliot Richardson appointed Archibald Cox as special prosecutor. Cox was a respected Harvard law professor with a reputation for integrity. Cox quickly demanded the White House tapes. Nixon refused. A court issued a subpoena. Nixon still resisted. On October 20th, 1973, the nation witnessed what came to be known as the Saturday Night Massacre. Nixon ordered Richardson to fire Cox. Richardson refused and resigned. Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaw also refused and resigned. Finally, Solicitor General Robert Bork, the third in line at the Justice Department, carried out the order and dismissed Cox. The image was devastating. A president removing the man investigating him. The reaction was immediate. Protests filled the streets. Editorial boards denounced the president. Confidence in Nixon collapsed almost overnight. But the fight for the tapes continued. A new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, took over and renewed the demand. Nixon clung to a claim of executive privilege, insisting that a president conversation must remain private. The case reached the Supreme Court in United States v. Nixon. On July 24, 1974, the court delivered a unanimous decision. The president must comply. Executive privilege was not absolute. No one, not even the president, who was above the law. It was a turning point in American history. Soon after, the tapes were released. Buried among hundreds of hours of recordings was one that sealed Nixon's fate. The conversation, dated June 23, 1972, just 6 days after the Watergate break-in, became known as the smoking gun tape. On it, Nixon could be heard instructing his aides to use the CIA to block the FBI investigation. It was clear evidence that President Nixon himself was directing the cover-up. When the tape became public, Nixon's last defender in Congress abandoned him. Even senior Republicans who had stood by him for years admitted the evidence was undeniable. By early August 1974, congressional leaders informed Nixon that impeachment in the House was certain, and conviction in the Senate was inevitable. With no path forward, Nixon made his choice. On the evening of August 8, 1974, he addressed the nation from the Oval Office. His words were heavy, almost broken. "I have never been a quitter, but as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow." The next day, Richard Nixon boarded the presidential helicopter for the last time. He became the first and only president to resign from office. Watergate was not the fall of a president. It was a national reckoning. It showed that investigative journalism could expose the deepest secrets of power. It proved that the institutions of democracy, courts, Congress, and press, could hold the most powerful man accountable. The truth had been revealed. The masks had fallen. And though Nixon was gone, the legacy of Watergate would continue to shape American politics, journalism, and public trust for decades to come. After 2 years of scandals, investigations, leaks, and confrontations between the White House and Congress, the Watergate train reached its moment of truth. A moment when President Richard Nixon could no longer maneuver, justify, or escape. The moment of downfall. But downfall was not only the end. It was also the beginning of a new legacy in American and global political history. The smoking gun in the summer of 1974, the nation was boiling. The courts demanded the president hand over the recordings. Congress threatened impeachment, and the public was exhausted by excuses. On July 24, 1974, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled against Nixon and ordered him to deliver the tapes. There was no more escape. Days later, the June 23, 1972 tape was revealed, known today as the smoking gun. In it, Nixon is heard ordering his aide Haldeman to use the CIA to pressure the FBI into halting its Watergate investigation. It was direct proof of his involvement in obstructing justice. Even his closest allies could no longer defend him. Pressure from Congress and Republicans before the tape. Republicans were divided. Some believed in his innocence. Others remained silent. But after the tape, the wall collapsed. A delegation of senior Republicans visited the White House and told Nixon bluntly, "You no longer have enough support in Congress. If you continue, impeachment is inevitable." Here Nixon faced the hardest decision in his life. A man who built his career on victories, from Congress to the Senate, then vice president, then president, now stood at the edge of collapse. The resignation speech on August 8, 1974. Richard Nixon addressed the American people on television. Millions were watching. With a weary voice and pale face, He said, "I no longer have a strong enough base in Congress to justify continuing. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective tomorrow at noon." With these words, Nixon became the first U.S. president in history to resign. The next day, he left the White House with his wife, Pat, in what reporters described as the farewell of a broken man. But resignation did not close the Watergate file. Dozens of aides and campaign officials were tried, among them Attorney General John Mitchell, senior aides Haldeman and Ehrlichman, and Charles Colson. They were convicted of crimes ranging from obstruction of justice to perjury, receiving prison sentences. In total, 48 people were found guilty of Watergate-related crimes. It was the largest political collapse in U.S. history. Days after the resignation, Vice President Gerald Ford assumed the presidency. On September 8, 1974, he announced a full pardon for Nixon. The decision ignited outrage. Many saw it as a betrayal of justice. But Ford insisted he wanted to heal the nation and avoid a trial that would divide America further. Politically, however, Ford paid the price, and historians agree. The pardon contributed to his election defeat in 1976. Watergate wasn't just a scandal. It was an earthquake. It reshaped the relationship between people, government, and media. Number 1. Trust in government. Before Watergate, 70% of Americans trusted their government. After, it dropped to less than 30%. It has never fully recovered. Number 2. The power of press. Investigative journalism, especially Woodward and Bernstein of the Washington Post, became a symbol of media's ability to hold power accountable. Number 3. New laws. Congress passed stricter campaign finance laws and the War Powers Act to limit presidential authority. The scandal's impact extended beyond America. Watergate became a global term. Political scandal worldwide adopted the suffix "gate." From Iran-gate under Reagan to Monica-gate under Clinton, the label stuck. Dictators and governments everywhere learned a lesson. Free media can bring down even the strongest rulers. Despite his downfall, Nixon never disappeared from history. He tried to rebuild his image as a foreign policy expert, wrote books, and gave interviews. Some still see him as a brilliant diplomat who opened relations with China and signed armed treaties with the USSR. But he could never escape the shadow of Watergate. Watergate was not just a break-in. It was a story of power, greed, lies, journalism, and the people. It showed that even the most powerful president could not fall because of small threads of truth. Democracy, though imperfect, proved capable of self-correction. Half a century later, Watergate still teaches a timeless lesson. Lies have short lives. But the truth, no matter how delayed, cannot be defeated.